Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Samuel Klein Cohen Jr., who is a friend of mine and who took his degree, a PhD degree, from Harvard University. He's originally from Birmingham, Alabama, and he's taught at Wesleyan University, at Brandeis University, at Brown University, and in 2008 he was distinguished visiting professor here in medieval history at UC Berkeley. His work is in the general area, two general areas that I put down. There are probably much more. One is the role of politics and revolt in the evolution of various European societies. And second, the impact of epidemics on the societies in which they occur. He's published more than 11 books, and I will just mention 4 as a sort of indication of the range of his work. One is actually there'll be 7. One is Laboring Classes in Renaissance Florence. The second is Death and Property in Siena, 1205 to 1800. Strategies for the Afterlife, which received the Moraro Prize of the American Catholic Historical Society Association. The fourth is Creating the Florentine State, Peasants and Rebellion, 1348 to 1434. Next, The Black Death Transformed, Disease and Culture in Early Renaissance Europe. Next, The Lust of Liberty, The Politics of Revolt in Medieval Europe, 1200 to 1425. And finally, Cultures of Plague, Medical Thinking at the End of the Renaissance. He's here today to address us on a new book that he has finished and is at the publisher, of which title is already on the screen, Epidemics, Hate, Compassion, From the Plague of Athens to AIDS. Please join me in welcoming Professor Samuel Cohen.
Well, thanks very much, Martine, and thanks for you for coming out on such a dreary day, although it's beautiful sunshine. I think I never imagined that giving a talk on epidemics would be a welcome, or could be a welcome, diversion from the events swirling around us, but I'll try my best. I start with this image, and I hope I get to it by the end. That is, I hope I get to the subject, not into the body bag, although I sort of feel like it at this point. And what I want to do today is really a fairly rapid tour on the question of the socio-psychological reactions to epidemics across time. I actually have the earliest plague is about 2700 BCE, although really I start with the plague of Athens in the 5th century BC, and I go up, sort of coda in one chapter to December 12014. So I never thought I would be such a contemporary historian. I'm a medievalist. But the real ending point, and the ending point of this lecture will be in the beginning of the 20th century. So I want to start really what I see as the dominant hypothesis and what got me interested in raising these questions at the beginning. It's sort of a chorus that is still sung with many of the same tunes. I don't know of any real critique of it, and it comes from a lot of big shots. Mainly it was stimulated by AIDS, but in fact the basic plot goes back at least to this man over here, Bertel George Niebuhr, writing at the end of 1816, a famous classicist and Danish statesman. I'll read just a few of these, and one can really, you can really get bogged down and bored by it all. But these are the ones that I think are figures that many people will recognize. And with Bertel in 1816 proclaimed, "Times of plague are always those in which the bestial and diabolical side of human nature gains the upper hand." And then I couldn't find this picture, but a great historian of Les Annales in the founding days of Les Annales, René Bacquerel, in a famous article, largely on cholera in 1952, proclaimed emotions of violence and class hatred were a part of our structure mentale, our constance psychologique. Now we would probably say, part of our DNA, but I'm really tired of that. Then the Italian historian Carlo Ginzburg, this is the 1990s, said that the prodigious trauma of great pestilences intensified the search for a scapegoat on which fears, hatreds, and tensions could be discharged. In the same period, this is in the mid-1980s, during the whole realization that AIDS was a pandemic, Dorothy Nelken and Sandy Gilman claimed blaming has always been a means to make mysterious and devastating diseases comprehensible. The famous medical historian Roy Porter concurred with Susan Sontag. Deadly diseases, especially when there's no cure to hand and the etiology is obscure, spawn sinister connotations. And finally, to end this, since it's 2011 and in earthquake-wrecked, cholera-hit Haiti, physician, anthropologist, and Harvard University professor Paul Farmer concluded, blame was, after all, a calling card of all transnational epidemics. Now, first of all, for a historian, there's a problem here for me, and there was a problem before I investigated any epidemics or pandemics other than the Black Death, that this is a dimension really without a chronology, without any sense. It's transhistorical or ahistorical. There's no sense of development, no sense of change, except implicitly, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Secondly, and I could read more for this, there really is this one model or one sense or dominant sense that when these diseases of hate arise, the victims are the others. It is this othering. It is the blaming of the scapegoat. And it's interesting. I don't have time to talk about scapegoats. And probably many of you know. It's a curious thing about scapegoats in antiquity were almost never the other. They're the most prominent people in a society, of the elites. But somehow, somewhere along the line, this whole concept of the scapegoat that we use today has been completely transformed. But that's something else I hope to dip into in my rapid tour of 2,500 years in now in 30 minutes or so, 35 minutes. And the other is this sense of mystery, of a mysterious disease. This comes out in the 1980s with AIDS. It was slightly there before, which has an implicit chronology. And that implicit chronology is, if you think about it, before the laboratory revolution, except for some diseases and some cures, like with smallpox, all diseases were mysterious. Ergo, we should assume or sense that the further back you go, well, before really 1870, these were the diseases that were the most explosive, the most violent, where the most hatred was expressed. The problem with these pundits, who are a lot smarter than me and better paid, is that they didn't have many examples. 3 or 4, 5 or 6 at the most. I don't even know who had 5 or 6, maybe Bracquerel. And they're lodged usually in narrow chronologies, or they could be where you look at the Black Death and then you jump to AIDS or something like that, or have one cholera incident. And I've collected, I did this database with about 2,000 things I call epidemics. Now, here's these other people, sorry. So here's a dip through the book, a quick dip through the book, and I start with antiquity. And I start with the most famous and the longest passage and description of any epidemic or pandemic in antiquity. Thucydides' famous The Wars of the Persians and famous description of the plague of Athens from 427 BCE to 430 with 2 or 3 outbreaks. And here we have a famous passage, which not only is famous with and associations with modern historians, but actually the person who's written the most on this is a great classicist named Duncan Jones. But even Jones wasn't quite aware just how important this one phrase out of about 8,000 lines in Thucydides' descriptions of this disease. It became important with Augustine, and then through the doctors in the 17th century. It didn't have much resonance in antiquity, but it's this statement that once the disease got to Lower Athens and Pyrrhus, some even said the Peloponnesians had put poison in their cisterns. So here, by biological warfare, I think that's probably right. If theory right, it's clear that Thucydides is a little skeptical of this. But others have molded it in a different way. This is intentional plague spreading. This is going after the other somehow. This is evidence that from the beginning you have this type of hatred spurred on by a pandemic. Once this is before really Thucydides gets into the thick of describing this plague of Athens, and it's described. A lot of people get the wrong impression about ancient historians and medicine because of the great detail of the signs and symptoms of this disease and the course of the disease and even notions about the epidemiology and contagion. This is extraordinarily rare. But nonetheless, he then only gets to this when it takes off, when the pandemic really takes off in Athens itself. And where you have the spread of the disease and killing over 30% of the population, and when he goes into the whole social, psychological aspect of this disease. And there, what do we find? Do we find any more suspicions of people and poisoning? No, not at all. It's dropped. And what we find instead is that people initially become scared and they don't help one another, but then they see that this is really not very good, that you need to bury these bodies, that you need to take care of your neighbors, and this is a disease that brings people together. And all of a sudden you have this abnegation and this unity of the society in the face of this disaster. And by the way, not all disasters are like that. What you see in antiquity, for instance, famine does split societies, but disease brings them together. And here I come to a great historian who's known to all of you, but has really not been studied for epidemics because he doesn't talk about signs and symptoms and epidemiology much, but he does constantly talk and indicate what the socio-psychological consequences of diseases are. So he's great for me. And I know of no other historian in antiquity who reports more epidemics than Livy in his History of Rome. And at 57 I count. And this is amazing because Livy wrote 142 books, of which, 30 survive. And still with those, this is what we find. And consistently through these diseases that he describes from the 5th century BCE to his own time, consistently, these are diseases that bring people together. They stop wars. They stop wars and people start to help their enemies. They stop revolts in Rome between the senatorial classes and the plebs, or the plebeians. And I'll just read you one. I mean, I won't go through all 57. I'll just one, which is I like this one because it's a particularly mysterious plague. They don't know where it comes from. The priests can't do anything about it. The doctors can't do anything about it. And they invent this new custom called lectisterium. And this is one, this new convention lasts for at least 200 years. And so here Livy, just to cut it short, says that what happens is that they read out the sacred text, and the texts tell them what to do. And what they do to combat this disease, throughout the city, the front gates of the houses were thrown open, and all sorts of things placed for general use in the open courts. All comers, whether acquaintances or strangers, being brought to share in the hospitality. Men who had been enemies held friendly and sociable conversations with each other and abstained from all litigation. The manacles were even removed from prisoners during this period, and afterwards it seemed an act of impiety that men to whom the gods had brought such relief should be put back in chains again. And another one that I like, which was the second one, second big plague using this convention, the matrons came out, the rich women of Rome, and they in their help and in their supplication, they washed the floors of the temples with their hair. I like that image. I wish I had that. I don't know any painting of it. At this then, and there's no blame. There's no sense in all 57 of any sort of hate coming out of this society with plague, with a lot of other things. There's a lot of hate in ancient history, don't worry. Another one with the plague of the Justinian plague of 541. Once it gets to, this is another, Procopius has the second longest tract of any pandemic in antiquity. And it also goes into great detail about the course of the disease, the epidemiology, the buboes in this case, and others. And here it's very different from the Black Death that we'll get to in just a second, in that what you have is a sense that this is really a unifying disease. And this is coming from Procopius, who has written this secret history of Justinian, and he clearly hates Justinian. He calls him a greedy bastard, and he also he says that this guy is just out to murder. He's dividing. There are two big factions in Constantinople: the circuses of the Greens and the Blues that are at one another's throat. It's sort of like America. Anyway, they're at one another's throats, but when this plague comes, they unite. They bury one another's bodies. They go to one another's funerals. They pay. And there's a big administrative move to give charity to the poor. This is another unifying event. Then we get to the Black Death. I mean, there are a lot of others between this, but there, I think this, before really modernity, is the great exception. And I think I've argued in other places it is the great exception. The Black Death of 1348 to 1353, depending on where you are. And the two movements that get into the textbook and repeated in every undergraduate course, and one is the flagellant movement that runs from Hungary all the way to London, where they're sort of dismissed and people just think they're boring, but it's a really, they are bloody. They split communities when they come in. There's all this competition for pittance and that street fights, between, and little has been done with this. Like, it's not just the flagellants. You have other groups, like those who specialize in washing feet, and they fight over sacred space to get their penance. And then the other one is the burning of the Jews. And I have calculated that well over 500 communities through the Rhineland alone are extinguished in 1349 to, late 1348 to 1351. And other groups, beggars, some places priests. This is a disease that really does split societies. It is a disease that is very much a disease of hate. Now, the two things that historians haven't countered with this or haven't reckoned. First of all, these reports and this obsession with these movements, they exist to be sure, is really a German thing. If when you read the chroniclers, which is the closest thing to our newspapers, and almost 95% of the descriptions come from Germany, and I don't think anyone cited that. In Italy and with the chronicles in the British Isles, you don't even have a sense that they know about these two movements, especially the burning of the Jews. What is much more universal is this cruel abandonment that chronicles from Eastern Europe all the way to Cork in Ireland, to the lowlands of Scotland and down to Spain. They decry this abandonment of children, of husbands and wives, and this is really the thing that upsets the chronicles the most. Even some in Germany who say, there's one chronicler who describes in detail the burning of the Jews, but then says, but what was even more horrific that I can't even explain in words was this abandonment of family members. Well, with both of these, they are short-lived. They are almost, well, they're particular. They are unique to the Black Death itself, not to the repetition of plagues that come afterwards. Some with mortality levels, at least in localities, that are at the level of the Black Death. And instead what you find is through the early modern period, into the, to the 18th century, these efforts by state and church for progression, for processions, for the ceremonies of Thanksgiving, for votive gifts to end the plague, which brings communities together. Often it doesn't make good epidemiological sense because this is a very contagious disease, quite unlike modern Yersinia pestis. It probably is Yersinia pestis, but it operates in a very different way. Okay, now to jump to early modernity, the end of the 15th century. And I think early modernity enters medically, intellectually, a new element in the notion and understanding of disease. You have contagion in antiquity, you had it with the Black Death, but there's a new sort of mapping out of and concentration on humans as carriers. And with this, there are two major diseases. One is syphilis, or what we call syphilis, who knows, or what the contemporaries called, at least originally the medical contemporaries called malfranchese, or the French disease. And in the historiography, you get this sense, yes, this is a great disease of blame and sexuality. People have even, in the 1980s, this is the great antecedent of AIDS and this type of hatred. But what do we find? First of all, in going through the medical text, there's a new sophistication. We finally find that these doctors become, in a sense, historians. They even go to archives in their zeal to trace Columbus's voyages and then soldiers' movements from Spain across the Alps into Naples, with the siege of Naples in 1494-95, and then the outbreak of this pandemic from these mercenary soldiers returning to their homeland. Already in the city I live in Edinburgh, you get notices about this malfranchese in 1497. But does naming and blaming, as Paul Farmer say, mean the same? Are they the same? No, they're not. There's no blaming of the French, or there's no blaming of the Spaniards. There's no tit for tat, as people assume that, okay, it's called mal de Naples, where you're by the French. No, they need a term, and the medical profession needs a term. They need to call it something. And so largely the medical profession calls it. But then they are sort of anthropologists in a sense. They are obsessed with the naming, and they go through and say, what do they call it in general? What do the popolo, the people call it? And you get all these names which have nothing to do with nationality. They have to do with skin disorders. The other thing here is that there's no blaming. This disease they understand better than plague. And I think they understand it better than we understand that ancient plague today. They understand it as being spread, at least in part. It's still God, it's still the air, it's still miasmic notions, but they know it's sexually transmitted from the word go. They know that sex has something to do with it, and they know it's being spread by prostitutes and mercenary soldiers. Are they any pogroms against prostitutes, or even legislation immediately during the epidemic phase of this against prostitutions, or even small events of beating up soldiers in Naples or when they go back to their homeland. No, not at all. And nothing like that with this late medieval Renaissance syphilis at all. Once it becomes epidemic, however, first in England in the end of the 16th century and into the 17th century, women in medical texts start to be blamed. But still, and there's some legislation that is certainly anti-women. But very little that really is against prostitutes in these early stages, and it's after this has become an epidemic. The disease really of hate is an old accustomed disease, not a new mysterious disease, and it's plague again. And plague comes back in the earliest dates I have at 1530 as a disease which spurs on this suspicion of others. You have in France they call the embrasseurs, and in Italy they call the untori. These are these people they imagine must be purposely spreading the disease. Now, in much of the historical literature, this is assumed to be coming from lower class people, the popolo or the plebs or whatever. But it's coming from the highest echelons of the medical profession and of philosophers like Jean Bodin and ecclesiastical heads. And the place where we know had the best documentation, which is Milan in the Great Plague of 1630, the people who are being prosecuted really aren't the people who are being suspected, picked up by the police, tortured, and in some cases, but actually only 10 cases that I know of being executed. These are insiders. They're not outsiders. They're native. Almost all of the ones who we have these trial transcripts for, and they're only 22. Even though this has been so studied, there are only 22. Although the chroniclers talk about many more. Even there, these are the majority. They are solid artisans all the way up to the baker class, and the people who are making the accusations, it is sort of an unstated coalition or alliance between poor women, for the most part, washerwomen who have these suspicions, and the elites in the medical, ecclesiastical, and governmental orders. Okay, but my sense is that the whole assumption about when plagues become plagues of hate is something of modernity. Modernity is the great incubator of a disease-hate nexus. And the first to do this in a profound way is cholera. And it's not the first cholera wave, however, but really the second cholera wave. But it's mainly the first cholera wave that moves through it is the first cholera wave in Western Europe. But it's moved through, in 1820s, the first wave moves through the Volga Basin and into Russia. And this has been studied very well. There's a lot of studies about it. Although they tend to be national, they don't tend to be comparative, and then none of them are really comparative over time, at least over the long duration of 3 or 4 cholera waves that last in Europe as major cholera waves until 1911. And what we find, and what I argue in this book, is that in fact, in places such as Eastern Europe, Russia, and in Italy, and not just southern Italy, these waves of collective violence and rioting become more widespread and more destructive with later waves of this disease into the early 20th century. Now, what is this? Is this a disease of the other? Just the opposite. Just the opposite. What you have is this dominant, abiding mythology that lasts in certain places like Venezuela even until 1991, and certainly, I'll stop there. But this is it is the marginal populations, like the Sarts and Astrakhan or the or the poor immigrant Catholics coming from Ireland and Liverpool and Glasgow, London, Edinburgh, New York City. These are the people who are protesting and are revolting. These are the people, and the targets are consistently hospitals, the medical profession. They are the ones blamed for spreading this disease, and in a sense, the mythology is that this is a grand Malthusian plot to kill off the population. So it's a way of lessening welfare payments. So probably shouldn't give it any big ideas right now. That you just kill off and you weed out the poor. And in certain places like England and in France, this pretty much dies out afterwards. In other places, such as Spain and more so in Italy and Russia, it blossoms into the late 19th century, in the case of Italy, really until 1911. Now, this is not a disease of the other. It's widespread. You have in Astrakhan, there's statements that this is 10,000 people, and then even in 1892, let me bring one place that's been in the news, Donetsk. In Donetsk, how many people know that Donetsk is a Welsh town? It's founded by the entrepreneur Hughes. It's brought in by the Tsar to the iron foundries to produce the ships for the new Russian Navy. And they burned the town to the ground. They just destroyed this entire town, which is now still, I think, even with the troubles, over 1 million. And these last in places like Segni, which is near Rome, too. There's a big riot of over 3,000. They burned down all the hospitals. They killed the mayor. They killed some doctors. And this is 1911, and it's the north of Italy. It's not the south. The great disease of the other and the great disease of violence in America, it surprises me that the historians don't seem to know it. And that disease is not cholera in the U.S. We do have some cholera riots, but nothing like Europe. And they don't really take the same pattern, except for the beginning in New York City, perhaps, but that's small, much smaller. And this is smallpox. And in smallpox, there's sort of two modes of violence. One, small-scale modes of violence is this of acts of cruelty. And the surprising thing about these, both that and more collective, large-scale violence, you don't really find them coming out quantitatively in any sense until 1881, this epidemic of 1881. Now, by this time, there's been a long tradition of cholera. Of smallpox and of so it's not a new disease, and in fact the mortality rates in 1881 can compare to those in 1853 or a very bad cholera epidemic that was a pandemic through Europe in the beginning of the 19th century. So this then is of the sort whereby I'll just give two examples. One of the small scale that. One I like it to a special touch. One is in Louisa County, Virginia. A black man, his family is dying of smallpox, and he goes in the snow 12 miles to the nearest town. The townsmen get wind that he's coming, and there to greet him in the front row, I like this touch, is the town's physician with a double-barrel shotgun, and warns him that they'll blow his head off unless he starts walking the other way fast. Another one that comes from near my hometown in Bessemer, Alabama, is the people. Again, it's elite townsmen or property farmers. They move. There's in the 1890s. There's a spread of smallpox from Memphis to Alabama. They set up a smallpox pest house, a little hospital. The majority of the patients are black. The blacks seem to be more susceptible to smallpox than the white population, quite unlike yellow fever. But with this, and so the farmers come out and they, as they say, riddle the hospital with gunshot, killing people. And then they are asked, here's the other thing, we don't have massive arrests or executions like we have with cholera with the low-class people. They're let off and they say, well, why don't you do this? And they said, we think that riddling, that shotgun is the best way to cure the smallpox. But diseases of hate are not the only ones of the big pandemics in the 20th century. There are other diseases that have a very different story against the same political, geographical context. And I'll concentrate on U.S. history here. One is yellow fever, and yellow fever does create great panic. And many historians, they think that, or sociologists think that panic equals collective violence, equals blame, equals destruction. In the case of yellow fever creates more panic if we measure it by migration, desertion of cities than any disease in American history. And yet, collective violence, it's really difficult to find. And again, there are certain tensions, to be sure, but like in Philadelphia in 1793, and then in New Orleans, 1853, and Memphis, 1878, and then these ones in the Bayou, they tend to bring societies again together. And in Philadelphia, it brings the black population really become the heroes, ultimately, of this disease. There's the thought that people from Africa have more immunity to the disease. It actually only applies to those from West Africa. And in Philadelphia, in fact, they die almost in as greater numbers as the white population, yet they come out, they nurse the population, the blacks and the whites. They sacrifice, they build the hospital, they're there working day and night, and they are praised for it. The same thing you find just in the preview or of the American Civil War in 1853. It brings Northerners and Northern contribution and charity to the South at the same time that blacks and whites are again united. And even more surprising, I think, is what happens with later ones in the period of Reconstruction and growing Jim Crow laws and racism. That in Memphis, 1878 really does interrupt that trend, especially after the disease starts to spread. And again, it brings these societies together. It is a uniting force in very much the same way that we see Libby's pestilences in antiquity. And the other is the Great Influenza. And a lot has been written on the Great Influenza. It's no longer, by any stretch of imagination, the forgotten disease that Crosby called it in 1976. But I think that not enough has been given to this great force of charity, a great force of charity that really hasn't been seen in any disease before or afterwards, and particularly here, the role of women. Quite unlike what happens with yellow fever, especially in the Deep South, where men's organizations and new organizations, the Odd Fellows and people like that, get in trains and go out to places like Natchez, which have been quarantined and risk their lives to succor the victims of this disease, and the Odd Fellows and this. But the Great Influenza is really a women's movement for diet kitchens, and part, but not entirely, certainly not entirely, a part of middle class women. I mean, one case study in the book has to do with El Paso, of how debutante girls really, for the first time, cross into the ghettos, the Mexican ghettos in the town, which are hit worse. The influenza does have this class dimension. It hits worse the poor. And from that, you would say, hey, they could easily assume from this that it's being spread by these others. But no, they cross the lines for the first time. And they sweep the floors of these victims, these poor victims. They take care of the children. They nurse these patients. And it's this movement that you can also see similar things happening in Canada and Australia and other parts of particularly near the battlefields of the First World War. Women are less active, less intense with this movement in Italy and France. But there you do still see this sense of some sort of community help, and you don't see any blaming at all. Not even the name Spanish flu. No Spaniards are being picked up and beat up anywhere that I know of in the world. This then is another disease of compassion, I call it, and not of hate. And it is a mysterious disease. Here's William Henry Welsh, who's the greatest pathologist, the most important physician in America in 1918, and he's put in charge by Woodrow Wilson to solve the problem of what this new mysterious disease is about. And he concludes that it's a new mysterious disease. So what I'd like to get at now is that very few people, in talking about the psychological effects of these diseases, points to the disease at all. Does disease matter? And I think it does matter, but I also think it's complex, and I don't have a good, easy model that will make me famous. Or probably if I had one, it would make me famous anyway. But at any rate, there's only one or two people. Contemporaries speculated on this much more than modern historians or contemporary historians today. Very few have even suggested it, and I think all of these conclusions, though I won't say this at Duke, were pretty simplistic, and one has to tease them out more. One, endemic diseases, custom killers, don't raise this hatred. Well, what about smallpox? In America, or what about plague in early modern Europe? These are custom diseases, and they do produce this type of hate. And they're endemic as well as being epidemic. Childhood diseases. Well, again, smallpox, it's hard to call it completely it's an adult disease, but the concentration is largely with children, with people who have who are naive to the disease, who don't have any exposure or little exposure. And also polio. Polio is a disease that doesn't cause much rioting, but quite a lot of blaming, and especially with an epidemic in New York City in 1916, which brings out in the same milieu. This is what interests me. The same women, I don't know if the same women, but they come out. Women do organize there, but do they go into the houses of the Italians whom they think it's a disease of dirt? They got it really wrong. And that do they help these Italian mothers? No, they criticize and want to jail the mothers for their dirt, their filthiness. So they inspect these people and bring the police in if the house is dirty at all. These poor Italians. Well, this is a disease of children. Then another notion is diseases that strike suddenly and disappear. And so cholera fits this. That's good. It fits the model, but plague, well, it occurs and reoccurs in some cities 100 times and it does come suddenly and disappears, but it doesn't really produce this type of hate. And actually, the great influenza came pretty suddenly and disappeared very suddenly, but it didn't produce hate at all. Then quick killers. I think this is something that does have some effect of these diseases that kill in 2 or 3 days or within a week. Those are quick killers even before effective medical intervention. And here there are some like cholera, like plague, but plague produces some hate sometimes, and especially Ebola, which is a quick killer. I think the most important variable, however, is certainly not mortality, but it is lethality, and it doesn't solve all these problems. But lethality, I'd like to get to the end of this with here is lethality. Cholera and Ebola, even though they're very different diseases, one's a bacterium, the other one's a virus, they have very similar effects of exploding bodies and blood. They're really pretty nasty diseases, but they also have high lethality rates, especially in West Africa, and where there's not the groundwork for hospitals wasn't in place right away, and cholera before dehydration kits, really at the end of the 19th century. The lethality rates are often above 50%. There are very few diseases like this that have epidemic force. Some claim that yellow fever was in Latin America when it came in the 17th century, but our figures for lethality with yellow fever is very difficult because so many people are asymptomatic. But in Philadelphia already in the 18th century, the lethality rate was 10%, nothing close to 50%. In the Great Influenza, the lethality rate in America was less than 1% or around 1%, a very different situation. And what you get here is, in fact, some of the similar mythologies of thinking that that physicians are the poisoners. That his quote. It actually comes from Liberia, and as one of the chants or explanations in 2014. Here, if the people come into the hospital, they don't leave alive. You find this repeated over and over again with cholera through the 19th century. It's like the Roche Motel. They come in, but they don't leave. And it's this suspicion because of this high lethality rate, and then leads to this type of violence. The other thing associated with lethality, and perhaps medically correct, certainly with Ebola, and probably with cholera too, is burial practices, the touchings of the individuals, the interaction with dead bodies. And what happened in both cases was the violation of the Irish wake, of vigils, of special places for burial, and this sort of parallel between the two, raising this anger amongst the families of the victims. And here, I think there's a lesson from history. And I was trained in the tradition of Les Annales, and not believe in lessons of history, so I feel a little uncomfortable. But here's a lesson, and it goes back to 2014. That there was really, people were really slow to react to what this hostility was doing, the distrust that the medical people thinking, they're good people and sacrificing their lives, but they didn't understand really the deep distrust they were making by interrupting with these rituals, and by not knowing that this was a very explosive disease, not only in terms of its epidemiology or its mortality levels, but also in terms of the social psychological consequences. And there I worked with a woman, we published an article together, Ruth Catholic, who worked in an Ebola treatment unit from the beginning, from 2014. Immediately she went from Vienna. And she told me that, look, it's not that the Africans, it was the educated medical personnel thought that this was new to history, that this type of reactions and, the murder of Red Cross people, the destruction of the vehicles, this was new to Ebola, and it was new to Africa. And I said, wait a minute, there's a great European tradition of this type of mythology making and distrust and attacks that are very much pinned on the medical profession. And so we wrote an article about that, and I really do believe, and they brought in medical anthropologists who did great work, and in 6 months the violence had ended because of talking about the problems of these diseases and distrust. But had they had a historian on the scene at the beginning, they would have known immediately that this was a very dangerous disease in more than just medical terms. And in fact, the two is with cholera, they interrelate because when you have these great, especially with cholera, these great revolts, people hide the disease. It breaks down the infrastructure. So it makes, we see in places like Veritaro, where we have good statistics in 1911, that the lethality rate and the mortality rate goes up because of the distrust and the collective violence and the breakdown of care. Okay, so to conclude, I think I'm on time, right? I'll be a quick conclusion. Well, basically conclusion, yeah, it's just history matters and disease matters. That's my conclusion. And there is a change over time, and it's just the opposite of what we would have believed from the great historians, sociologists, medical anthropologists in the 1980s to the 20th century about this. And the last thing, and I don't know how to, I have trying to find a witty way or a succinct way to say this, but just as diseases affect our body, different diseases affect our bodies differently, so do different diseases affect our collective mentalities differently. Thanks.
I'm going to take the cue now, so just raise your hands and I'll call on you. But before I do that, I made a mistake. I didn't tell you what he's associated with. He's professor of history at the University of
Medieval
Glasgow.
history.
Medieval history at the University of Glasgow.
So I was just wondering about another dimension of this that you touched on a couple of times, but I don't know if it's common, and that's the use of quarantine.
Yeah.
Is that a dimension of this that?
Yeah, it is. It's a lot in that, and particularly in India, for instance. When quarantine, it seems to be useless or counterproductive, as it was with modern plague, and Indians sussed that out from their own experience with it, and yet the British, the bloody-minded British, continued with these harsh restrictions, these interventions, again the breakdown of their rituals, the destructions of their idols, and taking people to remove them to these concentration camps or segregation camps. This was a big spark for the riots in India. And once the British government really caught up and abided with the science that was being produced as early as 1898, that this was a disease of rats and really a place more than person-to-person contagion, and quarantine was of little or no help whatsoever. The riots stopped. The riots, which were, I've collected about 80 riots in India. They cluster very tightly from 1896 to 1902, and they really start to get over around 1900. And it's because finally the British government realizes that quarantine is not. But quarantine doesn't always. And so I think with yellow fever, many American historians get it wrong, and that it's a phrase, the shotgun quarantines. And you think of illegal rednecks with their shotguns out and killing people. They don't. These are deputized, and they're legal quarantines. They're against different jurisdictions. And I only know of one case where one person is shot. And unfortunately, I've lost that newspaper reference, and I have to find it. But at any rate, it's when someone, one of the guards, one of the police, doesn't recognize a fellow guard who comes into the quarantine, and he shoots him. But none of this, it's not this violence. But thanks, yes, it's very important. And with cholera too.
Well, thanks for that. I really enjoyed it. I'm one of the medical anthropologists in the room. I'm God willing, we're not all reducible to whole pharma. That is one thing.
Well, I think he's a great man.
Hopefully we have a multiplicity of interesting perspectives on disease. It isn't all pharma. But I do want to know, what I wonder about is, I think that it's a robust description, you give us a robust description of the ways in which you envision hate around epidemics. Hate?
Hate,
A robust
yeah.
description of hate. So we hear your measures of violence toward a particular group or blaming a particular group. So I hear the ways in which you're measuring hate, but I wonder if you'd speak more about the ways in which you're measuring compassion.
Okay,
Because,
good.
I mean, one anthropological idea would be that any sense of communitas must exclude someone. So to have an inclusion of some group, you must exclude someone else. And so this notion, I'm wondering about the ways in which you see a certain community being formed, the compassionate community. Are there not ways in which some are being excluded from it?
Well, that's an interesting question. First of all, I see people breaking through boundaries with diseases like yellow fever, and even there's a crossover too. In Italy, you have with later cholera riots both happening at the same time. Well, in the 1884, northern men, again it's very much men, come down to the pandemic south and risk their necks to save these people and to be of help. I don't see where the controversies, to be sure. And in 1793 in Philadelphia, I talk quite a bit about the initial controversies. But I think maybe I'm naive, but I just see these people bringing together these societies in a different way. I don't see any exclusion. It may be there, but it doesn't make my sources, or if it makes the sources, I can't recognize it. So thanks.
Thank you. Can you say a few words about AIDS and how that fits into your study of epidemics?
Yeah, but good. Yeah, well, AIDS is my epilogue, and it's the only chapter which is moved by the secondary literature, but in a sense, it is a historiographical chapter, and not by primary sources. I mean, this synthesis is all driven by primary sources, and whether it's the histories, medical writing in antiquity, or whether it's chronicles in the Middle Ages, and then after that, it's mainly newspapers, some diaries, but it's thousands of newspapers. I've spent a lot of time blinding myself, reading microfilm and doing online searches. And with AIDS, what I argue, and this is from reading about 100 books and articles, and then I've had enough, I have a chronology that AIDS until not the early 1990s was perceived almost exclusively as a disease of hate. And two, I argue, and I'll get attacked for this, I'm sure, when we look at it in historical perspective, first of all, I know if you know of someone, I know no one who's really cataloged what the acts of violence are. A lot of stigmatization that is certainly damning, and I'll talk about that and the ways, and then what the evangelical right wing says, and people's lives are ruined by it, not just the victims. And but there's very little violence, and yet, like with the hemophiliacs in Florida, the Ryan brothers, they the sociologist, serious sociologist, who says this is just like the Black Death and the murder of the Jews. But it ain't. First of all, no one's murdered. The house is burnt down. They're not around. And immediately, the school, which didn't like what was happening, tries to offer them money and redo their house. And they say, no, we don't want your money. Put it into a fund to educate the rednecks. So the violence levels are just not congruent. In Africa, it's a different story. I go through some of that. But even in Africa, it's difficult to see organized collective violence in the way that we see with cholera, for instance, or with plague. And but then I argue in the 1990s that the whole historiography, I think, changes. And I don't think they don't claim it. No one, I don't know anyone who says this, but really what starts to be emphasized much more than hate is compassion. And the compassion that goes back to 1981, with these first, like the gay health crisis moving in New York and then San Francisco. It's not just the gay community either. And here we have great examples from Australia, for instance, with married women coming in and devoting themselves to the care of victims of AIDS, even though they're heterosexual, they've come from very conservative religious families. And it's this real sort of movement. And then I also, the three parts in this book are really, I only have two up here in the title, so I'm trying to chop words. But it's hate, compassion, and politics. And it becomes a great focus of political movement, of political action. Just as I argue, plague does in India in the early 20th century. So that's what I do with AIDS. So,
Well, it sounds like hate, though, emerges only in certain contexts. I mean, you mentioned the Jew burning, the African American man who was turned away, the Italians whose homes are being investigated and searched, and so there's a social context, a very definite social context here where the scapegoating is definitely being directed towards that.
Well, I meant to say this in the talk, I left it out, about going back to disease, and going back really to context. I mean, first of all, just without getting into different diseases, with the great influenza, look at the context there, and I spend a lot of time with both the micro context created by the disease itself. And here's my poster, which at least one person, quite rightly, was suspicious of and thought that this is a mistake because it's a World War I recruiting poster. But what the government is telling people, the first immediate context for the great influenza in America and elsewhere is health officials and government saying, look, if you see sneezers on the New York subway, beat them up, treat them like the tank men, and crush them. Then they go from this poster, and you see sneezers and big talkers that's spreading the disease, and you have, I argue, the most intense surveillance and laws, decrees, municipal decrees that interfere with privacy of any society I know, including the Puritans, at least in American history. But for instance, there are no kissing laws. Even if you're engaged, if you kiss and you get caught, you can be brought in. And certainly no spitting and no sneezing in public. And yet, against this, the people don't beat up people on the subways. And maybe, in fact, I've got some criminal records, I can find something, but no reportage whatsoever of this type of violence at all. Instead, you find people risking their lives. The other thing is diseases. For instance, in the first big wave of cholera in the 1830s, there's first of all a pandemic, an influenza pandemic that kills many more people than cholera. That's hardly known in history at all. It creates zero violence. Or you go to England or Ireland in the 1820s through the 1830s, and there's a big typhus pandemic. Actually, 70,000 in London alone. Oh no, 20,000 in London alone, 70,000 in Ireland. No violence. Nothing comes from that. But cholera doesn't. Or down the Volga in 1892, the same thing. You have an outbreak along with cholera of plague, and also one of typhus. But these don't produce any violence. It's only cholera. So I think I want to work on this. I really, because all historians are taught to explain everything in terms of context, and usually the immediate context, the immediate political context. And so people explain things like the cholera riots in Paris, for instance. Oh, it has to do with the July monarchy and the great anxiety of this new regime, this new liberal regime, and creating this political conflict with the old right, with the old priestly groups. But wait a minute, this stuff is happening in Britain and New York and in through the Volga basin in Italy, and there ain't no July monarchies there. And then, in fact, people explain what's happening in St. Petersburg with that violence by just the opposite. It's not the liberalization of government. There, it is the repression of the Tsar and of the Cossacks, and I think there's something to that. But wait a minute, you go to England and there's hardly any repression at all, even though I've found and described 72 different riots in less than 13 months through the British Isles. But they don't call out the military except 4 times. They read the Riot Act only once. There are no executions, unlike in some places in Italy and in Russia, you have 200 executions. So context, wait a minute, there's something else going on here. And here the lesson, I think, from the great French historian Fernand Braudel is, you can't explain pan-regional phenomenon by local context. And I think a lot of historians do.
I actually have a question, Sam. I've tried to follow this as best I could. You had to go through lots of, time.
You can read the book.
Is there an argument about some kind of change over time?
Yeah.
And then secondly, is it possible from a sociological historical period, which is sort of against your argument at the moment, I think, to say, to come to some understanding of saying under what conditions are you likely to get hate, and under what conditions are you likely to get compassion?
Yeah. I try and deal with that. I think it's a multivariable problem of which I can't sort out I can't do a regression of this. But I do have examples, and the first thing that pops into my mind is cholera in Germany, and Prussia. And the cholera in Königsberg, there's a pretty bad riot with a lot of people arrested, a lot of doctors, 5, 6, 7 doctors killed, I think, a lot of destruction to the city, and it looks like it's going to happen in Berlin, and it doesn't happen. It never happens in Berlin. And what happens in Berlin instead is that the king intervenes, and he, first of all, back to quarantine, he lifts the quarantine. Secondly, he lifts the very repressive laws about isolating, in other ways, cholera contacts. The bourgeoisie come out, and they set up dietitians, and money by the municipality of Berlin is given to the unemployed. And so, it's a condition, but it's more of a reaction, not just a condition. There are a lot of interest. What I try and explain with my 4 cholera chapters is there is change over time. Some places, this cholera riot, never happens. It's not universal, even though it spreads all over this vast geography. And some, they really only happens with the first wave, and some they spread later. And but I think I argue from the Italian material and the Russian material, the reason for the repeats and even the intensification of rioting is that the government is largely pig-headed about it all and continues to pursue the same lines. And saying, it's just due to these people's ignorance, and the repression remains high. And repression may work for some things. It doesn't work for cholera. I think the Russian case shows that very well. They send in the National Guard in Italy, and they caused towns as large as 6,000 to be completely disinhabited. And in Russia, with the Cossacks charging in, and open warfare. It's warfare. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Well, I just think that I'm just listening. I want to follow up with that, because it doesn't take a regression analysis, really. What I mean is to say what's in common about this. One could have said, okay, under certain circumstances, let's just deal with politics. One could imagine a repressive regime. I'm just making this up. You need a repressive regime for compassion or something, or getting involved, or in an open regime. In other words, you see these patterns that exist in which you see elements that are consistent, and whether over the centuries. Then you'd have
I say my whole argument is against this.
Yes.
I mean, what I find, like cholera, I think is a bit. Here we have this pan-European phenomenon that crosses the Atlantic across completely different political regimes, from Tsarist Russia to democratic Manchester to Republican, Republican/constitutional monarchy France. And Italy, where there's a revolt going on at the same time to free the country from the Bourbon regime, the repressive Bourbon regime. You find this great variation, and you find it continuing under very different governments. So this is what I'm emphasizing, the great variation. There are other things, and then with influenza, to take the compassion side, this is happening across completely different regimes, completely different circumstances in terms of the First World War. And yet, against context, I think the American example, with all this legislation and advice coming out daily in these newspapers, basically, that they don't quite say this, to beat up any spitter you see on the streets. And no one beats them up. They go instead, they risk their lives to help these families.
Frank?
Yeah, so picking up on this, there's one area that you don't seem to touch on, and that's the economic environment.
Mm-hmm.
So the political environment's one thing, but if there was, you know,
Yeah.
if the economic cycle was such, would that
Yeah.
potentially trigger violence?
Yeah,
I don't
I
know
think-
if we have much on the historical side, but we
Yeah.
probably have very good detail for the
Well-
last 300 years.
Well, I think one thing I'm simplifying here is like with cholera revolts. It does have a trajectory. There's this Biden myth that's there, but other things creep in. They become more organized, less spontaneous. They have leaders. I don't find any leaders, or hardly any leaders, who are mentioned, for instance, in the 1830s. Later it becomes different, and it is attached to economics. Particularly, one example is it's in Puglia in Calabria, which is in 1911, 1912. It's a really bad economic recession or even depression, and these are largely fishermen and fig workers, growers and workers, and they think, perhaps rightly to a certain extent, that it's coming out of the seabeds, and therefore you put these people out of work who are already impoverished, as well as the fig growers, because I don't know of any modern studies on cholera that shows that figs spreads cholera. So it's completely irrational. There is this economic context, and but you find, with plague riots, there's famine in some places, and there's not famine in others. There's good times. And there are also cultural differences. I mean, one thing about these riots in India, they maybe I should have talked about those more. They occur during the real tension between Hindus and Muslims. Real violence. I mean, violence on a greater scale. And yet this brings the Hindu and Muslim communities together, the plague and the plague riots, in solidarity against the British government. And the same thing in 1918 in India, during the Great Influenza. This is a real tension between, again, with the important riots between Hindus and Muslims, and it brings them together.
Larry.
Yeah, I suppose it's being a product of this age, but I listen to all this, and one of the things that keeps going through my mind is CDC. And I guess my question is what is the economic context? What is the institutional context? In other words, when it seems to me that we now have institutions like the CDC. In what way? I don't even know when the CDC comes into being.
WHO.
Right.
World Health Organization.
WHO for me is more important in 1947
Okay.
it comes in, and
You know,
and I know.
how does that change, and does it systematically change the presence of institutions like that? Does it systematically change the way these things are received?
Well, I can say the first thing that pops up in my mind is, in fact, a plague in gosh, in the Middle East, but in Egypt. Yeah, it's in Egypt in 1947, which is pretty violent, and it both brings certain groups together, but it really splits groups. And WHO is there, and yet it doesn't seem to have any effect on this collective violence. So that's the one case I know, the only case I know where you have a real presence of one of these global health organizations or national health organizations on the ground. And yet, one thing that is sort of surprising is despite, especially after 1911 and 1912, the levels of violence do decline in the 20th century, and that's, again, I think interesting because collective violence and genocide certainly doesn't decline. I don't agree with the Harvard professor, whatever his name is, that things get much more rosy. Yeah.
Speaking of roses.
But with disease, it's right. It doesn't. This stuff doesn't disappear, but it declines.
I have a question. I'm fascinated by how in some cases groups mobilize across tense boundaries, and in some cases they didn't. And I'm wondering to what extent that has to do with the distribution of the disease across groups. I can imagine cases where if it's not necessarily equally distributed, but somewhat distributed across groups, it's in the interest of one group to ensure that the other group behaves in a way that minimizes contamination. And so you might have an interest in coordinating. And in cases where it's starkly distributed, you might see more isolation. Is there any of that going on?
Well, I think there is, and yet there are contradictions to that model too. Like, back to El Paso, but you see it everywhere where they're spreading. It's clear that they now contract diseases, and they know it's coming from the south, in this case, from Mexico. And it's going into the Mexican ghettos. And this whole thing with contagion is another variable that I didn't put up because there are too many variables that people have mentioned. Contagious diseases are really some people say the most dangerous. But no, what could be more contagious than influenza? I mean, there are many diseases that are contagious. And these people risk their lives. They cross the boundaries. And I don't think there's no sense that they're doing it to save their own skins, except for in the collective sense of the common good. And you see a lot of that coming out in Toronto. It's interesting in 1918 about talking about the common good and how we have to mobilize. And they do. The women at first don't mobilize and they don't come out. And so there's a big movement to get them to come. And then there are all sorts of, this may be the whole problem and why. It is very complex and variable. In Canada, it's a top-down movement. Women are the shock troops, but for the most part, it's run by men. In places like Boston and New York, you really don't see that. In fact, you see a certain type of tension between people like Copeland, who's in New York, the head of the health board, and what women do. And they have their own grassroots neighborhood organizations. So there's quite a lot of
what if we had a prominent national leader who said that Mexico was sending over rapists, criminals, and people carrying TB? I mean,
that would help.
Doesn't that sort of one of the contextual factors that would be important for understanding violence? If you identify a certain stigmatized population with the disease. Ebola was like that. AIDS was like that. Even the avian flu was sort of like that. And now, and certainly TB historically has been associated with Mexicans.
Well, and also with Chinese. Depends where you are. But
it seems like politics is something that the politics of surrounding the disease incident would be important to understand whether there's
Yeah, but it also,
violence or not.
I'll say that it's much less important than people make it out to be, from what I see from my database of 2,000 epidemics through history. And as I said, with Libby's Rome, it brings warring populations together. But I don't know. In fact, with stuff with like the Chinese in San Francisco and it happens with some diseases and not with others. It does with TB. It does with particularly with smallpox. There you really see, and you see violence, much more violence than with TB. It really, but with plague, what does it do in San Francisco? It unites the Chinese and the white population, the merchant elites, against the National Health Service, because the whites are afraid that they're not just going to quarantine the Chinese population, and they think that it is, in fact, horrible that they're even quarantining, and that they have these forced vaccinations, which don't work anyway, against the Chinese. And there's this solidarity between the two communities. There are tensions, and there are even a few little skirmishes, but there's very different. The plague is very different from, especially smallpox and the divisions of that community. So there are a lot of variables, and I think disease has been wholly ignored. And I think it's the strongest variable. Yeah, I'll stick my neck out.
But what I find, I guess is a little uncomfortable. I don't know why I feel this uncomfortable, but I do, because you got, let's say you have two levels, if you'll let me conceptually, right? You've got a cellular, some kind of biological disease, and then you have a social disease.
Yeah.
That is how you deal.
Yeah.
And what I get from your argument, which it seems to me, is that they're both similar in the sense that there's a random outcome in both. It is simply random. Who gets it and who doesn't, and who reacts to it and who doesn't over time.
No.
And so there, in some sense, there's no pattern. I don't
No,
see.
there are patterns.
Well,
there are
I
patterns.
missed. I didn't
Okay,
see.
the patterns, for instance, and here with cholera, it's very consistent over time that the people who are on one side of the barrier, the people who are rioting, the people who are killing the doctors and mayors and other people, are the marginal population. Okay? They're the ones who are acting. The targets are fairly consistent from place to place. That there are variations. They go after the medical profession, sometimes nurses, sometimes not. They go after authorities, and they have the same abiding mythology. Smallpox, on the other hand, is consistently, not entirely, but consistently different. They switch partners. The people who are in the mobsters, are the elites. And the victims are either the victims of the disease or the poor. So these are consistent patterns. They're not over time.
Okay, well, this is where we have to end. Thank you, Albert. Thank you.